Good morning and welcome to the Heritage Foundation. My name is David Burton. I am Senior Fellow in Economic Policy here at the Foundation. Before I introduce our speaker today, I'd like to bring to your attention the next event in our speaker series. The speaker series is called Free Markets, the Ethical Economic Choice. Our next speaker will be the Reverend Robert Sricko, who is president of the Cato Institute, and he will speak on the moral case for a free economy. That will be next Monday, December 10th at 11 o'clock here in this auditorium. And then we will resume the series in January after the holidays. Our speaker today is John Allison. His topic is the philosophical fight for the future of America. He brings practical, academic, and think tank experience to our discussion today, and is a nationally known proponent for economic freedom. He is an executive in residence at the Wake Forest School of Businesses and teaches finance, among other things. He is a member of the Cato Institute's Board of Directors. Mr. Allison was president and CEO of the Cato Institute from October of 2012 to April of 2015. Prior to joining the Cato Institute, he was chairman and CEO of BB&T Corporation, the 10th largest financial services holding company headquartered in the United States. During his tenure as CEO from 1989 to 2008, BB&T grew from $4.5 billion to $152 billion in assets, which is a rather remarkable growth spurt. He was recognized by the Harvard Business Review as one of the top 100 most successful CEOs in the world over the last decade. He's received the Corning Award for Distinguished Leadership, been inducted into the North Carolina Business Hall of Fame, and received a Lifetime Achievement Award from the American Banker. He is the author of 2 books, The Financial Crisis and the Free Market Cure, Why Pure Capitalism is the World Economy's Only Hope, in 2014. And the second, The Leadership Crisis and the Free Market Cure, Why the Future of Business Depends on the Return to Life, Liberty, and the Pursuit of Happiness, in 2012. In addition to being a professor at Wake Forest University, he also serves on the Board of Visitors at the business schools at Wake Forest, Duke, and the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. He is a Phi Beta Kappa graduate of the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, received his master's degree in management from Duke University, and is a graduate of the Stonier Graduate School of Banking. He's the recipient of 6 honorary doctorates. We will have time for audience questions after Mr. Allison's presentation, and please join me in welcoming John Allison.
Thanks, David, and good morning. It's a pleasure to be here. I always enjoy having the opportunity to present at organizations which defend liberty and free societies. The title of my talk today is The Philosophic Fight for the Future of America. It's actually a presentation I've been making on university campuses, which has been an interesting experience, because as you'll see, it's not exactly aligned with what's happening at our universities. Before I get into my speech, so some of you know this, but I just want to give everybody a quick reminder. As David said, I was president and CEO of the Cato Institute, and this is the elevator speech I use at Cato, which is kind of a context for my presentation. Cato is the world's leading libertarian think tank. Our mission is to create a free and prosperous society based on the principles of individual liberty, free markets, limited government, and peace. We really do believe in limited government. We think the government ought to stay out of your pocket, but we also think it ought to stay out of your bedroom. We think government has a very important but very specific and limited role. The purpose of government is to protect individual rights. It's to keep me from using force or fraud to take what you've earned, and to keep you from using force or fraud to take what I've earned. So government is in the protection of individual rights business. We think because of that, government has 3 legitimate functions. National defense to protect us from bad guys overseas, police to protect us from bad guys in our neighborhood, and a court system so when you and I have a legitimate dispute, we can resolve it without the resort to violence. We think it's very important that government be limited because government has a unique and very dangerous authorization. Government can initiate the use of force. Walmart can beg you to buy their products. They can offer you special deals. They can entice you, but they can't make you. The government can make you. They can take your property. They can put you in jail. They can kill you. In fact, throughout history, governments have killed hundreds of millions of people. If force is not necessary, government is not necessary. And just commonsensically, human relationships, which are voluntary, produce better outcomes. So the next time you hear a proposal for a law, even if you kind of like the outcome, ask yourself, would you take a gun and make somebody that disagrees with this law obey it? If you wouldn't, you really shouldn't support the law, because force is a very dangerous entity. All right, in that context, now we talk about the philosophic fight for the future of America, and I would argue the philosophic fight for the future of Western civilization. This is a very important fight. I think it will have a profound impact on the quality of all of our lives and our children and grandchildren's lives. It's a fight that's very evident in universities today. On one side of the fight are those of us what I'll call the classical liberal tradition. Those of us that believe the Founding Fathers got it right, that life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness for each individual is a fundamental foundation for a successful and prospering society. On the other side of the statists of all kinds, there are plenty of right-wing statists. Right-wing statists tend to want to control people's personal lives. Left-wing statists traditionally wanted to control the economic side of your life, but now they also want to control your personal lives. The most visible, and I would argue by far the most dangerous set of statists today, are the so-called progressives. Progressivism is an old movement. It goes back over 100 years, but it's really raised its ugly head, in my view, with a lot of intensity in recent times. Progressives strongly believe that a relatively small number of elitists in places like Washington, D.C., always acting in the common good, know what's better for all of us. And they're quite willing to use force to achieve that end. Underlying the progressive movement are three philosophical pillars: altruism, collectivism, and egalitarianism. Altruism, collectivism, and egalitarianism. Altruism is not benevolence. Benevolence is a good thing. Benevolence is a very good thing. Altruism is otherism. It says everybody's important but you. Everybody's important but you. The problem with that, in the real world, there are only but yous. So if none of the but yous are important, individuals don't matter. And from a progressive perspective, individuals don't matter. It's the collective, the common good that matters in their judgment. As collectivists, they argue they're always acting in the common good. But the truth is their concept of the common good is an oxymoron. When the Founding Fathers got through with the Declaration of Independence and the Bill of Rights, Constitution, they pretty much defined all the legitimate common goods: freedom of speech, freedom of religion. When people talk about the common good today, they're usually talking about good for me and maybe not so good for you. Good for the auto workers, maybe not so good for the manufacturers. Good for the school teachers, maybe not so good for the students or the taxpayers. Good for General Electric, maybe not so good for their competitors. And so what you've got going on in Washington, D.C. today is a battle over individual perceptions of what's good for them, driving those outcomes. In addition, if something was equally good for all of us, would we be arguing about it? I don't think so. Underlying the collectivist mentality is a progressive sense of justice. And your sense of justice largely drives your political position. And the progressive sense of justice is what I'm going to call radical egalitarianism. Now, to some degree, the United States is an egalitarian society. All men are created equal. When the Founding Fathers were talking about equal, they were talking about equal before the law. Just because you were the son of a baron didn't give you any special rights. When progressives talk about egalitarianism, they're talking about equal outcomes, equal outcomes. While it's true everybody should be equal before the law, it's true all human beings ought to be treated with dignity and respect simply because they're human beings. It's not true that everybody's equal. In fact, I have never met two equal people. Every person in this room is a unique, special individual. We all have different strengths, different weaknesses, different abilities, different goals. That's what makes human life so interesting. We're all special individuals, but we're not equal. At the extreme, Thomas Edison, the Boston Strangler, are not equal. The only way to get equal outcomes from unequal people is to use force and take what one person has earned and give it to somebody else that hadn't earned it. It can be money, but it can be lots of other things. I'll concretize that for you with a story, tell you a little bit about where I went to school and what my age is. One of my heroes was Michael Jordan. I thought Michael Jordan was not only a great basketball player, I thought he was a real inspiration for poor kids. This will surprise you, but I am not as good a basketball player as Michael Jordan. There's a serious differential in performance. What's interesting is I can't possibly get to be as good a basketball player as Michael Jordan. Can't be done. I don't care how hard I tried, how hard you tried to help me. I can't get to be as good a basketball player as Michael Jordan. You cannot make the average great. You can make the average better. That may be a very productive, very noble thing to do. But you can't make the average great. However, you can make the great average. And egalitarians, by definition, are in the business of making the great average. It's very easy to make Michael Jordan as good a basketball player as me. You just cut his legs off, right? You say, well, we wouldn't do that. I don't know. We've been pretty tough on great people throughout the history of Western civilization. We poisoned Socrates, imprisoned Galileo, burned Joan of Arc. We're more sophisticated today. We do it with lots of balls and chains, very high level of marginal taxes, very intense system of regulations. We put balls and chains on people. What many people fail to realize is that great people make a disproportionate contribution to human well-being. Everybody in this room, your children, your grandchildren have a better life thanks to Thomas Edison. Edison not only invented the light bulb, he invented the research laboratory itself. Put balls and chains on great people and reduce the quality of life for all of us. Now, egalitarians, progressive egalitarians, like to claim the moral high ground. And he that owns the moral high ground wins the fight. This is really not a fight over economic theory. It's a fight over ethics. And he who owns the moral high ground wins the fight. And who can argue with everybody being equal? I think what motivates egalitarians is the most destructive of all human emotions, and watch it in yourself. It's called envy. Envy, which is the hatred of the good for being the good. And by the way, egalitarianism is a lot worse than I just described. Take any human attribute, intelligence, athletic ability, artistic ability. Half the people are above average and half the people are below average by definition. The only way for everybody to be equal is to reduce it to the lowest common denominator. For example, and this is another story, when I grew up in a church where the preacher wanted everybody to sing as loud as possible except me. I have a really bad voice. I'm a really bad singer. It would be tragic if everybody had to sing as poorly as I sing. A lot of joy would go out of the life, and I would be a big loser in that process. Now, when you confront progressives, and I had the joy of debating with progressives over the years, they'll say, oh, we don't really mean to go that far. So here's a question. How far do they mean to go? We're not going to cut the legs off of Michael Jordan. We're just going to cut 3 toes off his left foot and 1 off his right foot. Now, here's the interesting question, is who decides? Who decides how many toes to cut off of Michael Jordan's feet? That's when the power lusters, when the tyrants show up. Because they know exactly how many toes to cut off of Michael Jordan's foot, always in the name of the common good. Always in the name of the common good. Well, then if you're debating a progressive, they say, well, we don't really mean that. What we really mean is equal opportunity, which is unfortunately the way presented by progressives is another oxymoron. Half the people are below average in intelligence, half the people are born above average in intelligence, half above average in athletic ability, half below average in athletic ability, half, name it, any human attribute, half above, half below. How does all that weigh out? above average in intelligence, less than average in athletic ability, less than average in artistic ability. Where's all that balance out? In addition, something that you see when you get my age, and I see some people in here probably in my age group, you see siblings, brothers and sisters, who have been raised in the exact same family, same genetics, went to the same school, same socioeconomic class, and have radically different outcomes. Radically different outcomes. Sometimes it's obvious that one outcome is better than another. Sometimes it's not really clear. You know, Joe has more money, but he has an alcohol abuse problem. Mary has less money, but she's a lot happier. You cannot judge those outcomes. Here's the fact. We're all unique, special individuals. They all have different strengths, different abilities, different goals, different objectives. You would expect different outcomes from people that have different attributes. That's what being an individual human being is about. I think the Founding Fathers had it right. It is equality before the law that matters. How about those of us in the classical liberal tradition? What is our position? I am fundamentally an advocate of the concepts that I think made America great. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Each individual's unconditional right to their own life. Each individual's right to the pursuit of their personal happiness. Each individual's right to the product of their labor. If you produce a lot, you get a lot. And if you think about that ethics, it requires personal responsibility. It demands self-discipline. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. As classical liberals, in my case libertarians, we are primarily in the liberty business. We're mostly about liberty. Now, most people pay lip service to liberty, but we grasp that liberty is not just nice. It is nice, but it is essential for human well-being, both spiritually and physically. In the physical economic sense, in order to be productive, in order to be an individual must be able to think for themselves. If somebody makes you act like 2 + 2 is 5, you literally cannot think. You cannot think. In addition, all human progress, by definition, is based on innovation and creativity. Because in order for there to be progress, somebody has to do something which is better, which is different by definition. In order to be innovative and creative, you have to be an independent thinker. Somebody that thinks like the crowd cannot be innovative and cannot be creative. That's why entrepreneurs are so important. Entrepreneurs take the ideas of scientists and engineers and turn them into reality. Without entrepreneurship, there's literally no human progress. And what defines entrepreneurs? They are genuinely independent thinkers. They're experimenters. They fail a lot and then sometimes succeed. For every Google, there are 10,000 failed Googles. For every Walmart, there's 100,000 failed Walmarts. They see things that other people don't see. When I talk to college students, I hold up an iPhone and say, when I was in college, if somebody had shown me an iPhone and told me it's going to have all these capabilities in this little phone that it has today, and I could buy it, and almost anybody in this country could afford to buy it, I'd have said, that's crazy. 200 years, maybe, my lifetime, it's not going to happen. I don't know how Steve Jobs saw an iPhone. I don't know where that came from. That is the nature of entrepreneurship. And in order to be a successful entrepreneur, you have to be free. You have to have the liberty to pursue your ideas, to think out of the box, to experiment and fail. Communism and socialism are doomed to failure because they destroy innovation and creativity. Make a list of all the major innovations that came out of the Soviet Union or North Korea or Cuba. It's a really short list. Make a list of all the innovations that have come out of the hundreds of thousands and millions, I guess, of government bureaucrats in the United States. It's a really short list. Entrepreneurship is essential for human progress, and entrepreneurship is only possible for a free, independent thinker. Liberty is essential for human physical well-being. It's also essential for human spiritual well-being in the context of the pursuit of happiness. And when I talk about the pursuit of happiness, I'm not talking about having a good time on Friday night, although sometimes it's good to have a good time on Friday night. But I'm talking about happiness in the Aristotelian sense of a life well lived, blood, sweat, and tears happiness. When you're 80 years old, you look back and say, man, that was hard, and I'm glad I did it. Happiness in that context has to be earned. You cannot be entitled to be happy. You have to have a sense of purpose in your life. You have to have a strategy to accomplish that purpose, and you have to work to achieve that purpose consistent with your beliefs and your values. And you can only do that if you are a free person, if you have liberty. So liberty is essential for physical well-being, but it's also essential for spiritual well-being. When I talk about the pursuit of happiness, by the way, I believe that is a revolutionary idea in the Declaration of Independence. Before Jefferson, before the thinkers of the Enlightenment, everybody existed for somebody else's good. Good of the king, good of the state, good of the church. Nobody existed for their own good. What Jefferson said is each one of us has the moral right to pursue our personal happiness. That idea created the most successful and the most benevolent society in human history. And I agree with Jefferson. Each of us has a moral right to pursue our personal happiness. Now, it's interesting to reflect a little deeper on the pursuit of happiness. Most people are okay with the pursuit of happiness. But if you think about it, wow, that is a selfish idea. I'm going out and pursue my happiness. How selfish can you be? And selfish is bad, right? I can see Johnny in the sandbox, 3 or 4 years old, playing with his truck, not bothering anybody. Along comes Fred. Fred would like to have Johnny's truck. Discussion, debate, argument ensues. Mom, dad, son, a school teacher, kindergarten teacher gets involved in the argument. Mom says, hey, Johnny, give that truck to Fred. Don't be selfish. Don't be bad. 2 great moral lessons being taught there in the sandbox. First, where did Fred get the right to Johnny's truck? That's where our social welfare system comes from, right? That's where now Fred would like for Johnny to provide him with a Chevrolet Tahoe. Why not? Why not? But how about Johnny? See, I think that's the important lesson. And I suspect practically everybody, I would think actually everybody in here is Johnny. What did you learn in that sandbox? That for some reason you don't have a total right to your own life. For some reason you don't have the right to your own life. Let's talk about selfish a little more. And let's define it properly. It's acting in one's rational, long-term self-interest. Acting in one's rational, long-term self-interest. And the reason the definition is important, we have a false dichotomy that's typically presented to us. And that false dichotomy is to take advantage of other people or self-sacrifice. Neither one make any sense. In fact, a lot of people think that taking advantage of other people is selfish. The irony is taking advantage of other people is not selfish, it's self-destructive. It's self-destructive in 2 ways. You might fool Tom, Dick, and Harry, but they're going to tell Betty, Eric, and William, and nobody's going to trust you. And if you're not trusted, you're certainly not going to be successful, and more important, you're not going to be happy. At a deeper level, while we all try to influence other people, I'm trying to influence you today. If you let go of the reality and you try to manipulate somebody else's consciousness, you're going to do a whole lot more damage to your consciousness than you do to theirs. In my career, I've had the opportunity to meet a lot of successful people. I've never met anybody that was both successful and happy that got there taking advantage of other people. Now, I met some people who make a lot of money, I think, got there taking advantage of other people. And they're the most unhappy people I ever met. Taking advantage of other people is not selfish, it's self-destructive. How about self-sacrifice? Now, that is a moral code of our society, right? We're all supposed to self-sacrifice. You hear that at home, you hear it at church, you hear it at school, you hear it in the media. We're all supposed to self-sacrifice. I want to ask you to ask yourself what I believe is the most important question you can ask yourself. And for those of you that have children and grandchildren, and particularly ask yourself honestly how you'd like your children or grandchildren to answer this question. Do you have as much right to your life as anybody else has to their life? Do you have as much right to your life as anybody else has to their life? Of course you do. Of course you do. Why would you believe anything different than that? And by the way, if you're unwilling to defend your right to your life, you can't defend anybody else's right to their life. If I don't have a right to my life, and I don't have a right to my life, and I don't have a right to my life, and I don't have a right to my life, and I don't have a right to my life, if I don't have a right to my life, if none of the I's have a right to their life, nobody has a right to their life. And that is exactly, again, when the tyrants show up. Because they know exactly how to use your life for their perception of the common good. So in order to defend individual rights, to defend anybody's right to their life, you have to start with being willing to defend your right to your life. And of course, if you believe you have a right to your life, you should respect other people's right to their life. So as long as I don't use force or fraud to take what you've earned, and you don't use force or fraud to take what I've earned, we should respect each other's right to our own lives, to the personal pursuit of our happiness. Taking advantage of other people and self-sacrifice, neither one work. But there is a rigorous, demanding moral code that underlies free societies. It's also the foundation for organizational success and maybe most importantly, of personal happiness. We're fundamentally traders. We trade value for value. Life is about figuring out how to get better together. When I was running BB&T, we had a gut-level commitment to help our clients achieve economic success and financial security, and we expected to make a profit doing it. Life is about figuring out how to get better together. There are only two stable relationship conditions, win-win and lose-lose. Whenever you get greedy and you set up a win-lose, your partner, your spouse, will get bitter and you end up in a lose-lose relationship. Interestingly enough, anytime you get self-sacrificial and you set up a lose-win relationship, you'll get bitter and you end up in a lose-lose relationship. So in any meaningful relationship in your life, you should ask, what's in it for me? That's a fair question. But you should also ask, what's in it for them? Because if there's nothing in it for them, at the end of the day, there'll be nothing in it for you. And of course, it's in your rational self-interest to help the people you care about, your family, your friends, the people you work with. If you love your children, helping your children is not really a sacrifice. In fact, love is the ultimate expression of selfishness. Now, most people don't think that way, but I use this example with college students. You're getting ready to get married, big event in your life. Your future spouse comes up to you and says, honey, I'm so excited about marrying you. This is the biggest self-sacrifice I've ever made. Not exactly what you wanted to hear, right? If you really love somebody, you would risk your life to protect them. I would hate to have this choice, but if I had a choice between my life and one of my children's life, I'd choose to die because I couldn't live with myself if I'd made a different choice. Love is selfish in that context. I believe it's in my rational self-interest to support the United Way. United Way is an umbrella charity organization that does a lot of good in the community in which I live. I wouldn't want to live in that community if there were no United Way, and I wouldn't want my children to live in that community. In fact, I support a number of nonprofit charitable organizations, a substantial number. But I think there's a difference in kind in me choosing to do that, to give my money that I've earned away for purposes that I agree with, versus the government using a gun to take my money for whatever their purposes happen to be. What would be required for you to act in your rational self-interest? First thing I think you would have to do is hold what I call the context. Sometimes people talk about being selfish. They're talking about people that have a focus, a self-focus. They kind of have tunnel vision. And the irony is that's not in your rational self-interest because the rest of the world matters, right? You have to hold the context. You have to ask your question, what kind of world would you like to live in? And what would you enjoy doing, maybe nudging the world a little bit in that direction? You'd have a sense of purpose, making the world a better place to live, doing something you would enjoy doing, pushing the world in that direction. You'd be a purpose-driven individual. Secondly, you would take care of your body. You'd eat right, you'd exercise well. Thirdly, you'd take care of your mind, you'd read, study, think. You'd work hard to create healthy relationships with other human beings, particularly those that shared your values, because human relationships matter. And you'd have a rational value system. What if everybody had a sense of purpose, did the best they could to take care of their body, did the best they could to take care of their mind, worked hard to create healthy human relationships, and had a rational value system? What if everybody acted in their rational self-interest? I believe a huge percentage of the world's problems would go away. You constantly hear that the problem with the world's people are selfish. And when they say that, what they're really talking about is people kind of acting what I'd call randomly and doing what serves their short-term goals without really reflecting on what it's required for a good long-term life. And, you know, I had a brother-in-law, drank 24 beers a day, got cirrhosis of the liver, drank 24 beers and died. People say he was selfish. No, he was self-destructive. Bernie Madoff, the guy that stole hundreds of millions of dollars from his family and friends, Madoff said the best day in his life is when he got caught. Can you imagine spending 20 years stealing from your family and friends? That's not selfish, and that's self-destructive. In order to defend a free society, you must begin by first defending your unequivocal right to the pursuit of your personal happiness, as long as you don't violate anybody else's rights. And if you're not willing to take that position, frankly, you can't defend a free society, and you can't defend individual liberty. You have to begin with saying, hey, I have a right to my life as long as I don't violate other people's rights, and the same goes for them. That is the foundation for a free and prosperous society. Share with you one story that kind of integrates some of this stuff, and I'll close with a thought on selfish. From the time that human beings evolved 250,000 years ago until the early 1700s, human life expectancy remained the same. There was basically no material progress in human life expectancy. Something happened in the 1700s or 1600s that transformed the quality of life on this planet, transformed life expectancy. It's a curve that's just flat for hundreds of thousands of years, and this does this. First in Western civilization and now throughout the world. It was called the Enlightenment. It was the age of reason, science, technology, individual rights, rule of law, free markets, something called capitalism. Capitalism transformed the quality of life on this planet. It was the first system that allowed people the individual freedom to pursue their truths, to experiment, to fail. And it didn't matter what your social status was. And it was the first system that rewarded those that contributed the most for their contribution. But what's interesting about capitalism, it's not natural. Naturally, for hundreds of thousands of years, human beings were tribal, brutal, poor beings. Capitalism was an invention of the human mind. It has to be defended. It has to be protected. It cannot be taken for granted. And it is a system that allows people to pursue their own personal happiness. One last thought about happiness. Happiness is the end of the game, isn't it right? I mean, happiness in that Aristotelian sense of a life well lived. Sometimes business people think money is the end of the game. Nothing wrong with money. Money's a good thing, but it's not an end. It can be a means to an end. Happiness is the end of the game. And the foundation for genuine happiness is genuine self-esteem, not the stuff they peddle in the schools, genuine self-esteem. And genuine self-esteem has to be earned, just like happiness has to be earned. But the single biggest driver of your self-esteem is your work. You spend a disproportionate amount of time, effort, and energy at work. And I use work in the broadest context, raising children, very hard, very productive work. Whatever your work is, what makes it important is it drives your self-esteem. Something I said many times to the employees of BB&T. It's very important to BB&T that you do your job well, but it's far, far more important to you. Might fool me about how well you do your job, might fool your boss how well you do your job, but you'll never fool you. If you don't do your work the best you can do it, give me your level of skill, give me your level of knowledge, you can't do the impossible. But if you don't do your work the best you can possibly do it, you will lower your self-esteem. Now here's the good news. The flip's also true. Do your work the best you can possibly do it. Give me your level of skill, give me your level of knowledge, and you will raise your self-esteem, which is more important than whether you get a promotion or more money. It's about your fundamental character, who you are as a human being. There's a significant, I think, social implication to that. Take a construction worker, bricklayer. He has a tough, hard, demanding life. My granddad had that kind of life. This bricklayer has a tough, hard, grinding life, but he and his wife successfully raise their children. Maybe his granddaughter becomes CEO of a publicly traded company, maybe not. He has a tough life, but he gets something very precious from his work. He gets to be proud of himself. He gets self-esteem. Take that same bricklayer and give him welfare. He may be better off financially, but he loses part of his soul. He loses his self-esteem. There's a lot of conversation here in D.C. about security. Almost all of it has nothing to do with economic reality, but it's an interesting conversation. But even if it had something to do with economic reality, it's not on mission. Americans care about security, but this is not the land of security. People didn't get on a boat and come to Jamestown to be secure. The United States is a land of opportunity. The opportunity to be great, the opportunity to fail and try again. But most importantly, the opportunity of that bricklayer to live life on his own terms, to pursue his personal happiness based on his beliefs and his values, to pursue his personal happiness as a free and independent person. That's why people came to America. That's what made America great. It's a unique in human history sense of life that it's very important for us to protect. Thank you very much.
Thank you. We have time for audience questions. I will indicate who's going to be calling on, and then we have a gentleman bringing a mic around, and if you could introduce or say your name and your institutional affiliation, I would appreciate it. Start over here.
Hi there, my name is Helen. I'm at the Heritage Foundation interning in the Asian Studies Center. My question is, well, you said he who owns the moral high ground has the advantage. And I wonder if this is true, then why does libertarianism as a political philosophy totally dispense with a coherent moral system?
Some libertarians. I don't think libertarianism as a political philosophy does. I think some libertarians do. I think what the position that some libertarians take is that you have to begin kind of with politics, the idea that you have the right to your own life and the government is not supposed to interfere and take away your right to your own life. It's just to protect individual rights. Some of us libertarians, I personally am an objectivist. We do think there's a moral foundation for capitalism, and I personally think it's very important. I don't think you can begin with politics. You have to begin with metaphysics, your view of reality. You have to begin with epistemology, how do human beings think, and then you have to get to ethics. So I think you have to start with metaphysics to defend capitalism. And I think that's one of the weaknesses in some of the libertarian movement, not all libertarians, is that they really don't want to go and think about these deeper issues. So I think that ethics comes before politics. And I think the founding fathers got that. I think, really they always acted ethically, and they got flat feet. But in a broad context, they were trying to build an ethical society. Now, how you derive your ethics, in my case, I derive my ethics from nature. I think that we have to be consistent with the laws of nature and man's nature. And rationality is the foundation for human survival and success. And rationality requires freedom. You literally can't think if somebody makes you do something different than what you think is right. So what makes capitalism and liberty work is man's basic nature as a thinking being. We're not bees. and that requires liberty. It requires the freedom for you to think and pursue your own ideas. And for you to argue with me and change my mind, and me to argue with you and change your mind, that whole process is only possible in a free society, but only necessary because human beings are rational beings. If we were bees don't, they just do what the big queen says or whatever bees do.
This one.
Dr. Allison, thank you very much for being here. And I know President Trump, I believe, considered you as a candidate for a Federal Reserve director, and I hope that would still happen because I know you understand the constitutional monetary issue. And you mentioned the circumstance of the bricklayer. And for him to preserve his wealth, it was necessary to have an honest monetary unit. And it seems our country has digressed from that and created central banking, for which there's no constitutional basis. I do have a gift for you, a book titled A History of Central Banking by Stephen Goodson. And in the context of which I had recommended this book to the monetary policy group at Cato Institute. And merely for recommending the book, I was actually banned from attending their monetary policy conference this year after I've attended the last 5 years and asked questions of you and others there. Yes, well, with institutes like this and Cato, freedom of information, conversation, is the banning of books appropriate?
No, I don't. I don't know what the whole story is, so I don't really know how to respond to that. But banning books is not good.
I'm Bob Hershey. I'm an independent consultant. As an objectivist, how can one work with other people in an objective manner to get an economic consensus for things that you want to fund? For instance, some of the groups that help people.
Well, it depends on what you're talking about. If you're just talking about charity, I believe there's a very important role for charity, as I described. And I think that I benefit from the things that I support financially, whether it be United Way on one arm or the Cato Institute on another arm. I support both those kind of institutions. So I think there is a very important role for charity. But I do think, as I said, it's a difference in kind, me choosing to support these organizations and somebody taking a gun and taking my money and spending on things that I might not agree with. So I think in terms of business, you know, it's ironic. Almost all the examples they've used of market failure turns out that they weren't market failure. The classic case is they said the argument that you had to have government to build lighthouses because who's going to pay for the lighthouse? You know, because I'm only going to get to use a lot of other. It turns out there was no problem building lighthouses because everybody that had ships wanted to build lighthouses. You didn't have government. I have a farm up in the mountains of North Carolina, and we have a volunteer fire department. I give money to the volunteer fire department, whether my neighbor does or not, because I don't want my house to burn down. And so all these arguments for failure where markets can't solve problems, it turns out if you go back in history, or if you just look at a lot of things today, they just simply aren't true. It's not how markets work. If it's my advantage, the fact that you may be a free rider is not going to bother me because I'm not going to let my house burn down, right?
Thank you. Myrtle Alexander, Institute for Academic Management. My question to you is, what do you believe the role of government is in education in this country, especially as it pertains to, you talked about welfare, and then so looking at it from both an academic perspective for those that can and a vocational perspective for those that are not so academically minded at the beginning of their journey?
And that's a great question. I think in a certain way, from a practical perspective, it's a fundamental question. I strongly believe in the privatization of education. And I do that for a couple of reasons. First, what has allowed so much progress in business has been innovation and creativity. And part of the motivator is the upside, but part of the motivator is the downside. If you run a business poorly, you get to fail. If you run an education system poorly, you just get more money. You've got an inverted incentive. And interesting enough, and not surprisingly enough, the victims of public education are low-income people. Of course, because they don't have the political power. So I think the biggest enemy of low-income people in the United States is public education. I would myself support vouchers and tax credits to parents and students and let them, and I think the market would some people make mistakes? Yeah, but would all the people make? No. People figured out how to go to Walmart, right? You know, Walmart's had a huge improvement in quality of costs for poor people in the United States. And I think there would be Sam Waltons and Bill Gates and Steve Jobs out there that would revolutionize education, and we'd be stunned. You know what interests me? I'm in a university now, teaching some. And then I have some friends of mine that have kids in the elementary school and stuff. They're basically doing the same thing they did when I went there in the 1950s and 60s. I mean, there's been so little innovation, it's kind of stunning. You know, if you look around at everything else, there's huge innovation because it's of necessity. because you get to die. You get to go out of business. So I think the single most important thing we could do would be privatize education, subsidize poor students, poor kids, subsidize families and parents, but don't subsidize the schools. And I think you'd see a radical improvement in education very quickly. You see a lot of experiments. A few of them wouldn't work, but they're almost always better than public education. And then you'd see a Walmart or an Apple or somebody emerge and develop a much better model. So I'm an advocate of the privatization of education and then subsidize poor people.
I have a question. I know you've been doing a lot of traveling and speaking at universities. And what have you found is the most effective way to communicate to young people the importance of a free society and the ethical or moral superiority of free enterprise over socialism or other government control of the economy?
Well, what I find, and this is should concern all of us that believe in a free society, most of these students, and I often talk to seniors, sometimes graduate students, mostly juniors and seniors in college, have never heard about the basic ideas that underlie a free society. It's kind of stunning in a way. And part of what I'm trying to do is get them energized to think about the contrasts in the extremes, the progressive movement, the classical liberal movement. And then I try to get them to read books. I wrote a book on leadership that's I think is effective for students, is oriented towards students. I have other books, because in one lecture, you're only going to move the needle an inch. But if you talk to 150 kids, I found that maybe 15 or 20 are interested enough to read a book, and then maybe they get involved in the process. But it's a tough uphill fight because the government owns the schools, right? And this is an indoctrination issue, maybe even transcends the critical thinking issue. And they've indoctrinated so many of these students. I've been interested in, and it's not surprising to me, that college-educated females vote very differently than white males that haven't gone to college. And I think a lot of it's because they get indoctrinated. They take liberal arts courses. They don't even take business courses. They don't take economics courses. And they get indoctrinated in a series of beliefs. And they can't make a connection to economic reality because they've never taken an economics course or they don't understand how markets work or business works. So I think it's an interesting process. Now, what I'd like to do would be transform the university, but that's a difficult thing to do. As you and I were talking, one of the real tests we have now is, except for maybe a Hillsdale, there aren't any private universities left in the United States. Because I'm at Wake Forest University, and the percentage of revenues that Wake gets from grants and from student aid is probably, I don't know, I'm guessing here 50, 60% of their revenues. Well, who's going to tell the government no when you get 60% of your revenues from the government? And that is scary. So that ideas tend to get concentrated. You even see this in science now, because almost a huge percentage of research is funded by the federal government. So what are they going to do? They're going to research things that the federal government wants to hear. I think there's a big problem in the environmental issue. I'm not sure about global warming. I don't know the answer to that, but I know that the research is not balanced. Because if you go out and say there's no global warming, or that maybe you might say there's global warming, but it's not a big problem or something, you're done. No more money from the federal government. So you have this bias in research that makes it hard to judge. Maybe it's a giant problem. Or maybe there's just massive incentive on one side of the coin. They talk about corporations. Corporations give about this much compared to the federal government. Even medical care. What diseases do they pursue? Not necessarily the ones that we would rationally pursue. They're the ones that are politically correct at the moment. And so I think it's a really big problem, the government ownership to the educational system. And I just think we just keep hammering at it. I don't have a simple solution. I mean, there's no easy answer because we're outnumbered and they're indoctrinated. all I hope you can do is plant a seed. Plant a seed.
Other questions? All right. Well, yeah. Go ahead.
So going to the education thing, I mean, at the beginning you kind of outlined a pretty strict version of libertarianism with the courts, the police, and the military. How does education fit into that? And I guess if you don't mind, I'd throw a second question in there is, what do you think about the veil of ignorance from Rawls, where we have to look, it is moral or ethical to consider things as we would as if we were souls, and before we were born, I mean, what kind of risks we would be willing to take? Would we be willing to take the risk we might end up with a very high IQ or be born in Africa, or, you know, there's all sorts of risks that we might insure with a free market, but we can't because we haven't even been born yet.
Well, those are two different questions. In terms of, a lot of libertarians would not support the idea of subsidizing education. They would be for privatizing education. I do support the idea because I do think we've got a history of government interference in education that's created a lot of disadvantages. I think a lot of the poor people in the United States would be much better off if we never had a public education system. They would have figured out the problem. I think the public education has really put balls and chains on a lot of students. And I think we have to undo that history. Maybe 10, 20, maybe more like 30 or 40 years down the road, then we get rid of the subsidies. And just let people give money to kids. I mean, I would support, I'd give a lot of money to charity. I'd be glad to give money to help. In fact, that'd be really fun if you could do it in a productive way. I don't want to do it to get them to go to public schools because I think they're learning the wrong ideas. So I think that in the short term, you subsidize low-income kids to make up for what I think has been a terrible abuse of low-income kids. And then in the long term, you get rid of that and you get charity to do that. And I think it would do it. And I don't think there'd be that many poor people, by the way. I think in a true free market society, the percentage of people that would really be poor is very small. To your second question, I think Rawls is crazy. I mean, he's saying that, I mean, we all are in that draw anyway, aren't we? I mean, what's his point? I don't get it. We all drew what we drew. And how does it all, you know, yeah, am I supposed to not enjoy my life because somebody else didn't get as good a draw as I did? What does that mean? And how's that going to make that other person happier? I don't get it. I don't think that's ethical. I think it's unethical. Actually, I think it's pretty daggum evil. That's when Joseph Stalin walks into the room. That's how that always ends, right? It always ends with Joseph Stalin in a room.
Just tell them.
My name's Brendan O'Connell, and I'm with the Florida Bar. My question is, what do you think cultural change in the country will do to capitalism? And what I have reference to is the decline of the family, the $9 billion a year that has to be spent in universities on remedial education, and our recent report about the decline in our life expectancy, and our horrendous debt that no one in Washington will talk about, and no one in Washington will, they will throw money at the decline in the family, but nobody will talk about the root cause to change our culture back to what it was, perhaps in the 50s.
I think you have a great point, and I would say I'm very concerned on one hand. On the other hand, and I think this is a balancing act, and I have to admit one day I feel one way, one day the next, but Cato has a website called humanprogress.org that looks at human well-being from as long as you have records. Everything that matters on the planet, not necessarily in the United States, is better than it's ever been in human history. Human life expectancy is way improved. Income is way improved. Every day, 100,000 people get raised out of poverty, primarily by free markets and free trade. And so there's whopping improvement. And a lot of it is because societies hadn't got there, but places like China and India at least have moved towards freer societies, and they're getting them. And there's billions of people that are getting better off. Now, my own view is the United States is at least plateaued. I mean, we're improving in some ways because of this cultural issue. So I think there is a challenge, and I think it's a non-trivial challenge to restore, and I view it in philosophical terms. I think the culture was based on certain basic ideas. Individual rights, personal responsibility, those kind of ideas, I think that's the real threat, is those ideas are under attack. Because now nobody's responsible for themselves, right? When anything happens, I'm a victim. Everybody's a victim, right? I'm a victim because I'm, female. I'm a victim because I was born, wherever. And I think that is really dangerous. When I was at BB&T, we had a poster up on the wall that said, if it's to be, it's up to me. We had a guy climbing the wall. And that idea is under attack, that whole sense of personal responsibility. So on one hand, I'm very concerned because I think the cultural issues are significant. And I think that capitalism, free markets, liberty are all very intangibles, and they can go away. They're not natural. They're not natural to human history. Now, on the other hand, some of those ideas are actually finally getting disseminated in the rest of the world. And so you're seeing this big improvement in human progress. But you can go for a long time. Human beings have gone for thousands of years when things actually got worse. So it's a fight. That's why I'm here. That's why I go on college campuses and talk about these ideas. But so kind of basic principles, honesty, integrity, personal responsibility, are foundational to society. They make free markets work. If you lose those principles, and the more force you have, the more government acts, the less responsible people become because they have less control of their lives. And I think that's very dangerous. So I think there is actually a correlation with the expansion of government and the decline of the cultural issues you're talking about. I think they're tied together.
Government is responsible for the decline of the family.
I think they have a role in it. They're not the only cause of it. They're not the only cause. There are other, I think to the degree that they fund the education system, and the education system has contributed, I think, materially in that decline, then yes. I'm not a particularly religious person, but when they took religion out of the schools, they took ethics out of the schools. And you can't take ethics. And there's some things you don't have to be, honesty, integrity, those kind of beliefs aren't just based on religions or any particular religion. And they made a terrible mistake, but this is the problem with it being the government school system, because there were areas where people didn't agree on the ethics. They just said, well, we're just not going to teach ethics. But ethics is more important than 99.9% of the stuff they teach. So, the demise of ethics in the educational system contributed, it's not the only factor, to lots of this other stuff that you're talking about, in my view. And I think you've got to restore. That's why in a private education system, you teach the ethics and you get the outcomes. And kids will be more successful because they've learned the ethical principles, and parents will say, well, maybe I ought to send my kid to that school. That's how they chose Walmart, right? It's the same basic idea. So the lack of a market for education, I think, has been a material contributor to the decline of the cultural issues you're talking about. Yes, ma'am.
Adele Hartswick. I was just wondering if you had an opinion on the debate in Randian circles between open and closed objectivism.
Oh, I try not to get into that debate. It seems silly to me. To me, there are two things. There's what Rand said, which is objectivism, because that's a philosophy. I think that any philosophy has to evolve to some degree, reflecting more knowledge, and also Rand didn't cover everything, with law and that kind of stuff. So I'm not for, I think some people say that they agree with Rand's basic beliefs and don't. And I think that's unfair to Rand and philosophy. On the other hand, the idea that people extend some of these beliefs or look for holes, not holes in the basics, but there's a lot of stuff to be done. I think that's good. So I'm kind of between the two. I'm not objectivism is a philosophy. It is not a religion. And I think that's what's dangerous. I think a lot of objectivists take it as as kind of a hardwired belief versus a process of thinking. It's really about people using their reason. And that, I think, is unconditional. But that's going to lead you in a lot of different directions, in my view.
Okay, anybody else? Well, thank you very much for coming. This concludes our event.
Thank y'all.